Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. And this one I'm going to be covering my round 3 game from the Charlotte GMIM Invitational in January of 2019. In this one, I have the black pieces. If you've been following the first few rounds of this event, I've drawn my first few games, and I had 2 whites, so this is actually my first black game of the tournament in round 3. And I was still kind of playing a little bit shaky and was trying to kind of right the ship with this one. My opponent was Denis Shmelov, or Shmelov. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but he's someone that lives in the U.S. now, but plays under the Ukrainian flag. And he's a really good technical player from what I've seen of his games. I do have a kind of great memory from one of the games I played against him because in the last game I played against him before this one, it was actually the last round of an event in June of 2018 that actually secured me my first Grandmaster norm. I needed a win with black in the last round, and I managed to take him down. So I did feel I did have good memories playing against him and was trying to repeat them. In any case, my opponent played c4 this time. This was different than the first game we played where he actually played d4 and it went to a London system. So clearly a little bit of switching it up and a little bit of targeted preparation against me perhaps. I played e6 and then g3. And g3 kind of signals that, that white is willing to kind of play this kind of like Catalan position, play bishop g2, knight f3, castle kingside. That's kind of like the setup is fairly unassuming, but just to try and get a positional type of game. I went d5, bishop g2, and bishop g2 is actually an interesting move because it kind of invites d4. And what d4 does is d4 is actually it kind of makes these almost reverse Benoni type of positions. Normally what transpires is something like knight f3, knight f6, castle, c5, and then actually black can go e3, and then knight c6, takes. And in this type of scenario, it's actually like a reverse Benoni where white is playing the position almost a tempo up. And the difference in the structure is that now black actually has played e6 instead of playing e5. So it took 2 moves to get in the potential e5 if black decides to get it. And that normally means that white is kind of in good shape playing this black system because they have a more time than they normally would. So it's actually quite popular, and I actually didn't want to kind of I didn't want to accept the invitation, if you will, because it was kind of clear to me like Shmelov was like, yeah, go for this if you want, and I was like, I'm not good feeling it. So I went c6, just trying to keep him things solid, and also introducing the idea of potentially taking on c4. Note that taking on c4 here is not even a threat. White can just recover it the pawn with queen a4 check. And yeah, this is a line, but I kind of wanted to play c6 to at least give white the thought that I might consider taking. So after c6, white played knight f3 anyway. And I went knight f6. I just kind of was like, I'm going to keep the structure solid, not go pawn grubbing. And after knight f6, b3 reinforced that pawn. I played knight bd7, bishop b2, and bishop d6. Bishop d6 is a little bit unusual. Bishop e7 is definitely a little bit more solid. The reason bishop d6 is a little bit unusual is because in many times in these types of positions, white might consider playing d3 and then eventually e4. And if white ever gets to play e5, then you could see my pieces on d6 and f6 would be forked. So really got to be a little bit careful with bishop d6 because it's usually not the right diagonal or the right square for the bishop. And it also isn't the right diagonal for the bishop because this bishop usually is just, it's just blunted on this square. I mean, the g3 square is not, there's nothing going on here. So usually it's not hitting anything. So like we normally say it's biting on granite. But I did have an idea in mind with bishop d6, and it was actually to consider putting the queen on e7. Um, so yeah, it is what it is. So castles, d3, and actually e5. And when I saw that White was going to try and play d3 and e4, I thought, you know what? I probably should consider playing e5 because, at the end of the day, if I don't take that space, White is. And now taking the center is usually, is not something you're able to do with black. So I thought, why not do it? So after e5, c takes d5, c takes d5 was played, and I kind of expected this because the consequence of playing e5 really early is that now my center might be a target and my development is not yet complete. Note that my bishop on c8 is not ideally placed, and my knight on d7 is not ideally placed, and that's the justification for giving me the center. Is in an ideal world, this knight on d7 would love to be on c6. That's the natural developing square for that knight. And then my bishop would have scope to develop, and all would be good. But because my knight's on d7, it's not as ideal, and it means I have to do a little bit of gymnastics to justify the position. So White played knight bd2. I was a little bit surprised by this move. I kind of was expecting knight c3, again, the most natural developing square, thinking about ideas of knight b5. That was kind of an irritating move to me because let's say I play a move like h6, not a good move. Then after knight b5, this bishop needs to defend this pawn, right? It needs to still remain in contact with this pawn. But if I go back, if I go bishop b8, then there's this really pesky move, bishop a3, hitting my rook on f8. And that would really result in rook e8. But then now White has this move, knight d6. And at the very least, White can secure the bishop pair here. So I thought knight c3 is a little bit more natural because I thought I would have to go a6 probably. And I don't know. It just seemed like a more normal move to me. Knight b2 is fine as well. I went rook e8, again trying to overprotect the e5 pawns that my knight on d7 could start moving. And then White went for e4. e4 really surprised me. I don't know why it should have surprised me because it's kind of clear that this knight on d2 needs some squares. I mean, it needs the e4 or c4 square, and the d5 pawn is the one thing in the way of that. Additionally, what can happen is that once the d pawn is gone, now the e5 pawn becomes even more of a target once these two pawns are traded. So, pretty good move, I think. I went d4, trying to, justify my space advantage, continue to take more space. I could have considered knight c5. I did look at that move, targeting the d3 square. The thing that concerned me about it was actually this move, knight takes e5. A little tactic after well, let's say bishop takes is played. Now White has this move d4, or even bishop takes e5 and then d4. Both of these are options, and White recovers the piece. But apparently I might be able to go rook takes e5, and after d4, knight d3, and it turns out I'm actually doing okay in this type of position. Tough to see though from far out. I mean, this type of line is kind of tricky to see, and I did not see all of this. I think the key move here is that after d4, after knight takes e5, I take with the rook. I did not consider that. And after d4, I actually can go knight d3 and hit the bishop. And again, I totally missed this variation where I'm actually in reasonable shape. But it seems like my knight is kind of trapped, and I just didn't think I could justify the setup, but apparently I can. So anyways, I went d4, and again, this gives the c4 square for the knight, so knight c4 is kind of obvious. I went bishop c7. An argument could be made that maybe the bishop should be on f8, actually, because with f8 it actually eyes a lot of the dark squares on the queen side, whereas on this diagonal it's not doing as much. So bishop c7 and a4. A4 is a really good move, cementing the knight on c4. I really wanted to play b5, but a4 kind of stops that. And now I went knight b6. I thought, you know what, this knight in c4 is really bothering me. I probably want to get rid of it. Maybe that's a good idea. In hindsight, I maybe could have considered other moves. I mean, maybe knight c5 is interesting. Maybe slowly preparing b5 is interesting. Maybe I could get away with playing b6 and a6 or something like that. I don't know. But anyways, I went knight b6, knight fd2, again saying, sure, we could trade these knights, but then another one's going to replace the one on c4. So I took, takes, and then I went bishop e6. And I thought I was finally getting my development going and close to connecting my rooks. Again, if you've watched me before and watched this channel before, you know I really value connecting rooks. I think that's a very important aspect of chess. Usually the side that connects the rooks first is the side that wins the game, in my opinion, my observation. So definitely think about that in your own games. But the issue here in the position is that even though even though I have space, I kind of don't have a great pawn break right now. Again, I was thinking about preparing for this b5 break, but it takes a lot of time and might not even happen. And again, black, on the other hand, has the potential f4 break. And so, again, no pawn break, no plan, and it's very unclear to me whether I'm going to be able to get my pawn break going. So I was kind of concerned here, and maybe a little bit maybe a little bit more concerned than I should have been, but I was. And now white plays queen d2, which is effective move connecting the rooks, and you see now, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, I could connect my rooks as well right now, but it just seems like white has the advantage here, even though I have more space in the center. And I tried to take some drastic measures to address this, but they weren't accurate. I started with the very controversial bishop takes c4. Now, my concept with bishop takes c4 was that white can't take with the d-pawn. The reason white can't take with the d-pawn is because now I have a protected passed pawn, and now I thought after a move like a5, I can actually maneuver this knight to c5. This b3 pawn is weak, and you know everything is kind of good for me now. And then I thought this bishop on g2 would not be playing. The issue is actually what white actually played, which is b takes c4. I totally underestimated the strength of this move. I kind of thought that I can bring my knight to c5 anyway, and then have like a nice blockading square and good pieces. And I also figured that my bishop on a5 would also serve as an effective blockader, perhaps going to c3 one day. And I thought that I would have all this time to set up this blockade on the dark squares and would have a good position. It turns out that I just need too many moves to get that done, and white has counterplanned in the meantime. So I started with bishop a5. That was the first part of the plan. And after queen c2, I went rook c8. Rook c8 is already kind of a weird move. If I wanted to go for this plan, I should probably start with knight d7, but I'm certainly not better here. The other element is that, and maybe the reason I was thinking about rook c8 is because I was always thinking about this f4 push, right? This is the one I was thinking about. And f4 here isn't a bad move because it allows knight g4. This is a common theme when the f-pawn is pushed and there's a d-pawn in the center like this, is that the e3 square is really vulnerable to a fork, and the knight on e3 is a really good piece. So obviously that's not the way to go, but what I totally underestimated after rook c8 was this move that's, you know, should have been clear to me, which is bishop h3. Very, very strong move. And the point is, not only do you take away the g4 square from me, now the bishop is bearing down in this whole diagonal, and my rooks just can't stand c8, and so it just has to be put in a place it shouldn't. So I went rook c6, trying to justify my rook's placement there. I didn't want to go back to the b file or the a file. But now white continued with bishop a3. And you can see in the span of a few moves, both of these bishops are really bearing down on my position. And, you know, I'm not going to be able to set up this blockade. Now, again, I should not have allowed this bishop h3, so I could have considered a move like queen d7 to stop that. And then all of a sudden, this bishop doesn't get active. I mean, this bishop really should never have been allowed to go to h3. But then again, if I play queen d7, then you could see my knight d7, knight c5 maneuver is not on the cards. So you could see that the concept was flawed. So anyways, rook c8, bishop h3, rook c6, bishop a3. I'm kind of in trouble here. I decided to go bishop c7 because I thought, you know what, these two bishops are really a problem. I need to try and get rid of one of them. But this is another step in the wrong direction. Instead, I should try and, play knight d7 or shut down this b file with b6, which at least for the time being would keep it closed, because if rook a b1, I could play a6 and at least stop the rook from invading for now. The problem is that now white can play on both sides of the board, and even f4 is a reasonable move now because I don't have access to any of these squares on the king side, in particular the g4 square. So yeah, tough spot to be in. So I went bishop c7, rook a b1 is very obvious, and then I went b6, and my position is just totally uncoordinated. And one thing that happens in many games is if rooks are split, if rooks aren't connected, they're usually very vulnerable. You can see a lot of tactics where this happens, and my pieces are just not coordinated. Where white's pieces are way more coordinated, and now I'm kind of in like a defensive crouch, which is tough. So a5 was played, very strong move, just ripping open the position, and I played bishop d6, just trying to trade these bishops, but I'm in trouble. I'm in big trouble. So queen a4 is played, again, now taking advantage of the split rook situation we talked about. I went queen c7, trying to protect them. Then a takes b6, great move. A takes b6, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6. And you might say, hey, you accomplished something. You managed to trade the bishops. Now white doesn't have the two bishops. Well, the issue is that white's one bishop here is still better than my knight, because this bishop controls this really important diagonal, and this knight doesn't really have scope. It's not really going anywhere anytime soon. And now the other issue is my pawn structure. This pawn on b6 is very weak, so that's a problem. And black now has access to the A file. So now the B and A files are white, excuse me. And I'm kind of like a sitting duck. So rook b5 was played, excellent move, fixing the b6 weakness, and also eyeing the d5 square, believe it or not. The point is that this knight now is kind of tied down, because if I ever move that knight, rook d5 is a possibility. Now I went queen c7 to kind of back up and hold some squares of my own. I was also worried about queen a7 infiltrating, so that's why I went there. And now rook fb1, and you can see white is just honing in on my weakness. And the only sort of target that white might potentially have is this d3 pawn, but there's no effective way to get to it or put any pressure on it. And so I'm really in a tough spot. I went h5. I think that was a good move considering the circumstances. The point was that I give my king an escape square so that I don't have back rank issues anymore. And in some positions, I was thinking about playing knight g4 to at least plug the bishop for a little bit, and maybe think about a rook lift to f6. So that was kind of my thought process there. Rook b4 is played. I'm not sure I love that move, rook 1 b4. I think white could have probably infiltrated in other ways, but there's nothing totally wrong with it. I think the idea was white wanted to get the queen behind the rook like this and create an Alekhines gun, as it's called, when there are three heavy pieces lined up. When the queen and two rooks are lined up, it's called an Alekhines gun. And typically in that formation, you want the queen to be the last piece in that formation, because the queen is the most valuable piece, and you don't want to trade it off. So you tuck the queen behind, you have the rooks in front. I played rook b8, again, still in this defensive crouch, unfortunately. And now white went for this tactic with rook takes e5, which I actually completely missed. And it just is, again, a sign that, like, I'm just not playing very well, and I'm making it a little bit too easy for white. The problem now is that my rook on c6 is totally hanging, and so even when I take this rook on e5, I lose a pawn. The other problem is that this rook on this e5 pawn was a very important base of my chain. So now you can see I have multiple weak pawns now with with d4 and b6. So really big problem. I played rook takes c4, a counter sacrifice, if you will, just because this rook on e5 is still hanging, and I thought, okay, maybe I can get a pawn for the rook and be fine. So after rook takes e4, queen takes e5, I regained my pawn temporarily. The issue, though, is that I still have two weak pawns, and white still has the better minor piece. Because my knight is worse than this bishop, so I'm still in a world of pain. And after rook takes d4, now I'm still a pawn down. Now, for the moment, white lacks a little bit of coordination from the standpoint that this queen is tied to this rook on d4, and my queen is well centralized, and I thought maybe I could try and get something going on the queen side and distract with my b pawn, that I might be able to get something going. So I played b5, queen b4, again, kind of shuts that idea down. And now I went queen c7, again, searching in vain for some counterplay, eyeing the c1 square. Again, I was thinking about some lines playing knight g4 and trying to get some counterplay. Queen b2 is played, good move, trying to just stop my queen from infiltrating. And now I went queen a5. The idea now was, you know what? I want to get to the e1 square. Again, I'm trying to get counterplay some way, shape, or form. The other point was this, now I can potentially support my b pawn. So white played rook b4. I think it's a good move, just shutting that idea down. And you can see I'm kind of flailing with these one-move threats, but it's kind of what I have to do right now. And after rook b4, I actually played knight g4. And the idea with knight g4 was, again, I should be losing this game, but the idea was if bishop takes g4, h takes g4, this one pawn is a real thorn for white, and it prevents white from moving as kingside pawns because of en passant. And I thought in some scenario, if I ever got my queen to the d1 square, I'd have perpetual check because I could go f3 and then d1 and back again, and this king would kind of just be in this box and have to go up and down. So that was the idea with knight g4. And if white doesn't take that knight, then the f2 pawn is just maybe a little bit vulnerable. So after knight g4, white played bishop f1, and I played rook b6. And my idea was if this knight on g4 stays here, now I'm hoping my rook gets active and I'm able to get some counterplay on this f2 pawn. So I was thinking I might have some vague chances. So after rook b6, d4 was played, targeting my b5 pawn. And I went rook f6. And this was kind of like my last stand, my very, very last stand, because I'm jettisoning my b5 pawn and just going for it. White actually played f4. It's kind of a crazy move in my opinion. I thought there were other options. I thought maybe rook takes b5 was actually prudent because the queen on the queen a5 is hanging, so I'd have to move the queen somewhere else. And I thought there might be some way that white can win the game by force, because now white is 2 pawns up. So I was thinking maybe there's some rook b8 check, king h7, I don't know, maybe e5 actually. And the point is that if I go rook takes f2, now there's queen b1 check, and the queens have to come off the board. And this should be pretty good for white. Although maybe there's rook d2 here, and maybe it's not so clear. So, and not to mention the pawn on h2 is hanging. So maybe it's not as clear as I thought. But I had a feeling that my last-ditch stand should not work. And I must say I was very happy to see f4, because now with f4, black has managed to weaken a lot of these squares, and just this whole diagonal all of a sudden is a little bit loose, not to mention the second rank. So I was very pleased to see that. So after f4, I actually went rook c6, trying to kind of take advantage of this momentary weakness that white created. Um, Note that this rook on b4 looks up kind of paralyzed because if it does move, my queen could come into e1. One other thing I will note, I didn't note here, was that in these lines with rook takes b5 and queen e1, I am threatening a very nasty trick, or I thought I was. It was in some lines, I actually thought knight e3 might work. The point is that, I mean, it doesn't work here, but let's say like h3, knight e3. The point is I'm hitting f1, and if captures, then I have this nastiness, and I get in. So that was another thing I was looking at, although I recognize after knight e3, white has a move like queen e2 to stop those ideas. So it was just something I was thinking about. In any case, after f4, rook c6, white played bishop takes b5. And I was happy to see that because now after bishop takes b5, I played rook b6. And now we have a weird situation where white is two pawns up and has a lovely center, but this king all of a sudden on g1 is very airy. And additionally, now this bishop on b5 is pinned because white just kind of went into this pin. So for the first time in the game, I actually have some semblance of counterplay. So white went for king g2, and I actually think now I'm totally fine because I actually went knight e3 check, king f3, and knight c2, and I think this was missed by my opponent. The point is that now this bishop is pinned on b5, the queen has been tied to this rook, and all of a sudden this rook is attacked by my knight. And if the rook backs up, let's say rook b3, I have some really, really interesting play. I mean, it just is kind of a mess. But I'm thinking that queen d2 might be decisive because now all of a sudden I'm threatening knight e1 checkmate. Would you look at that? Let's say h3 is played. Knight e1 checkmate. That is a pretty amazing checkmate. And again, if the rook moves somewhere, well, knight e1 is still a threat, but in many lines as well, there's also knight takes d4. So all of a sudden, I'm getting really, really active. So after knight c2, white actually played queen takes d2 and admitted, you know what, I messed up. This is not winning for me anymore. I played queen takes b4, and now the material theoretically is equal because I'm up in exchange. White has 2 pawns for the exchange, and so it is even material. And yeah, just a very funky scenario. Now, thing is, I would love to, this king on f3 still seems kind of airy, so I'd love to put more pressure on it, and this bishop is hanging. But the issue is my king is also very airy, and so white went queen c8 check. I have to go king h7, and then went queen f5 check, and I went king g8 because if I play like rook g6, I'm voluntarily pinning myself, and I did not think this was a serious winning attempt, to be honest. I mean, it just did not. I did not think this was good. I thought the bishop would move somewhere, and now white might even have chances. So after that, I just went king g8 back, and in this position, we actually agreed to a draw because he was going to repeat again. So kind of a very fortunate save on my part. I really very much underestimated the structure that happened after I gave up my bishop pair, and it's kind of funny because I do favor the bishops, and I'm if you've watched any videos, I talk about the bishop pair a lot. It's something I try to get, and so giving it up like that was a little bit unusual, but I thought there was positional justification for it. And it just turned out I did not have the time I wished I had to do all the things I wanted to do. So very poor decision, but fortunate to get the draw in the end. All right, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, please like and/or subscribe. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please be sure to check out the link in the description. Thanks. Bye.